How is everybody doing? Strength Chat episode 150, and today I have got a very special guest for you. Today I'm joined by an applied sports scientist with over 25 years experience in high performance, as well as being involved in over 250 peer-reviewed published articles. Today I am joined by the one and only Tim Gabbett. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, Stephen, and thanks for having me on.
No worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. Um, what's been happening in your world? What have you been up to recently?
Well, we've going through the same pandemic that everyone else is going through, so I just have to keep reminding myself that I can't control the situation, but I can control my thoughts. So, it's a little bit like preparing for a marathon with no finish line. We don't really know when it's going to end. So we just got to keep our head down and keep putting one foot in front of the other, and it'll end and things will get better. But at the moment we're just trying to do our best.
Yeah. And has that affected your schedule too much, or have you still been able to carry on with work as much as reasonably possible?
Well, yeah, certainly early on, things went into lockdown early on in Australia, and that impacted the teams that we worked with. So there's elite level athletes that are high performance athletes, but they're amateurs. A lot of them they have to work and they have to study, and so they don't get into a bubble like some of the professional teams that they've set up over here. So we had to try and be creative about our training. They weren't allowed to do contact conditioning, so they weren't allowed to do wrestling, and they weren't allowed to come into the gyms as they would normally. So we had to kind of keep them loading, try and keep
Yeah.
them loading. But also, if we couldn't get them in the pool for our water polo players, we had to find creative ways of keeping some load into them, just so that their chronic load didn't track down to the basement.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a weird, a little bit of a weird situation because I know from the sport over here, especially at like when you're saying about amateur, the grassroots level, that's been sort of stopped completely, which has been kind of strange to see really. So yeah, there's the joke flying around. It's sort of like an indefinite sort of off season, if you like, with no sort of like what you're saying about the marathon. So yeah, it's a little bit of a strange a strange period with, especially with how the season's going as well, which has been definitely interesting. For everyone who might not know your background, your involvement in high performance, in coaching, and obviously in the research that you conduct as well, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Yeah, well, my main background is in sports science, and probably geared more towards strength and conditioning and um, and load training load research and the application of that. You mentioned early on that I've the papers that I've written, but it was never really a goal of mine to write papers. It just became it was a bit of a hobby more than anything. um, I wrote, I kept like a diary or a journal of all my training logs. I started with my own training, but any sort of sessions or programs that I had in place for the athletes that I was working with, I was just keeping a training log like most people would do. Um, but there was always a conceptual involvement in the program. We're always asking questions of, could we do this differently? What if we change this? Would we get a better result? What if we did it this way? Wonder if we'd hold up better under fatigue or whatever. So that it was just a logical extension to go from having all of this information in a training log, and I enjoyed writing. It was kind of like a bit of a hobby for me. Um, and then they turned into a few papers. But yeah, it was always about how am I going to help this coach? How am I going to help this athlete? And the paper was kind of like a bit of a afterthought, really.
Right, okay. Because I know, I always wonder, sort of. I know from being at university myself and reading journals and all and that sort of stuff. You kind of get dived into it, and the more I've sort of flitted in and out of that. A couple of the research papers that you've put out there, it comes across as though you're wanting to help the coach or the athlete, because it writes like that with a little bit more of an application, which is a little bit probably a little bit easier to read than some things, which is like, how do I get my head around this, which is beneficial, the more you've looked at it. With your how did you actually get involved in coaching, and was it something that you always wanted to get involved with from your own training, or how did that start off?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was a young fellow, when I was about, I think the youngest I can think was probably 10, 9 or 10. My father used to train all sorts of athletes, runners. He used to train footballers, soccer players, rugby players, and I used to just follow him around all the time. And their joke was that they used to call me his shadow, because wherever he went, I was with him. And so he'd be training the players, and in those days he used to do it all with them. So he wasn't there just standing with a stopwatch. He'd be in there sort of pushing them along as well. So it makes it very hard for them to say, stuff you, I'm not doing it, when he's actually in there in the trenches with them.
Yeah.
And I used to jump in too, and I probably wasn't in the fastest group, but I'd get in a group and try and hang on, and I learned a lot about training in those really early days.
Yeah.
And I probably just smelled liniment early on, got the smell of it, and I've been addicted to it ever since.
Yeah. Ah, nice. And what was did it what was your first sort of did you do it at university and get involved in as a job? Was that always the plan?
Um, early on, my grades weren't great from school days. I worked really hard on my sport, and there was no time to work on the actual the study
Yeah.
part of school. I can remember just going home exhausted after training sessions, and having a shower, having dinner, and then falling asleep on the floor pretending to study. Um, but so when it came to getting into uni, it took me a while to get into university, because I hadn't worked hard enough at the
Yeah.
things that mattered to get into uni. So then I had to work pretty hard to get myself in there. Um, once once I got in there, once I knew that was where I was going, I knew what I was going to do.
Yeah.
There might have been a couple of little distractions along the way, that they were kind of like red herrings that they were there just to throw in front of me to distract me. But the thing that I always enjoyed, and it's just something that I've always enjoyed, the camaraderie that comes with being around athletes. I think being around younger people keeps you young as well. So there was never really, and even now there's you know I often say to people, I wonder what I'm going to do when I have to grow up. I don't know what I'm going to do when I grow up, because I can't see myself doing anything other than what I do. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'll just keep doing it as long as I can.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I know from especially from when I was at university. Well, before I got into university, yeah, I had to laugh there because yeah, now that I don't play as much rugby, at the time it was just rugby, and then it's like, oh no, actually, I actually need to get some homework done, or I need to do this. But yeah, since leaving university, I always joke with a couple of other of my friends that were university who now maybe have office jobs or something everything like that. And I get to wear shorts for a living and walk around a gym. So yeah, it's kind of I see what you mean, as though the environment that you work in, it is enjoyable. And I think, like what you said at the start, if you get involved in something because you enjoy it, and if you can turn that into a job, it doesn't feel as though because it's interesting. That's why I set up the podcast. That's why I read other things. That's why it's a lot more beneficial for me to read journals and articles that are a little bit easier to read, which is only going to help me, but also help the people that I coach. So obviously, when we were setting up the podcast chat, I sent you over a couple of topics, and sort of the first question, which might sound a little bit broad, but just talking about injury prevention. Obviously, this is kind of on topic because, especially like what you mentioned at the start, and sort of infinite off season, and obviously they're going to get back into games. From a training point of view, how much can injury prevention actually be prevented, if any?
That's the kind of the tough question, because whether it's even possible to prevent injuries, it's very hard to say that you've prevented something if it hasn't happened. So we could all say, oh, we've prevented all these injuries because they didn't happen. But the reality is, there's something to be said about training and for injury prevention and training for performance. And the more you see wherever you go, you hear of medical staff are at one end of the spectrum. You've got strength and conditioning staff at the other end of the spectrum, and you have prehab on one end, and then high performance exercises or training at the other end. And the reality is, I actually don't see them as being poles apart, and they're probably a continuum of training. It's all training, and really what we're talking about is progressing or regressing certain exercises. So we're either making exercises harder or we're making them easier. I do believe from a personal viewpoint, but also from an evidence point of view, that our thinking around training has definitely changed over the last 5 or 6 years. If we go back before then, there was definitely a school of thought that high chronic loads contributed to injuries. And you just had to pick up any textbook and it'd say overuse injuries occur due to overtraining. So how do you prevent these overuse injuries? Well, you just have to make sure you don't train too hard. But now thankfully, I think there's a bit more common sense being applied, that we can't manage athletes away from training. We can't manage them away from load and think that we're going to do them a favor, and think that by wrapping them in cotton wool, that's going to reduce injury risk. What it does is, by wrapping them in cotton wool, we know there's evidence there to show that that's when your injury risk is highest. When your loads are lowest, that's when your injury risk is highest. But the bigger issue is the fact that when you expose an athlete to low loads, they're not an athlete anymore. They can't perform, and that's the really sad part, because you send them out and on game day, or you send them out to competition, and you set them up to fail in a number of ways. They can't perform the tasks that they're required to do. They can't perform at a high level, and they get injured trying. So they just fail on a number of different levels.
Yeah, a couple of things that you mentioned on there, because obviously you mentioned about sort of the prehab side of things and the strength and conditioning, and talking a little bit more of a continuum, whereas progression and regression exercises. Do you think there is, or what are your thoughts on, is there actually a thing as prehab, or is it just good training? So it's that balance of, if you're following a good program, progressing and regressing the exercises dependent on the athlete, changing the load depending on them. Is that just good training, or would you class that as prehab? If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about where prehab, the actual term came from, it was originally came from getting injured athletes prepared for surgery. So it was about just making sure that we tried to minimize the muscle wastage going into surgery, so that they weren't starting from the basement when they came back. That we tried to prevent that detraining going into surgery.
Yeah,
I mean, whether you call it prehab or whether you call it activation or whether you have another name for it, personally, I just think it's training.
yeah,
It's the training that I do that prepares me for my higher level stuff. So if I want my athlete to perform at the highest demands possible, whether it's in an Olympic Games individual event or a team event where they have to perform the most demanding passage of play, then in order to get to that, they need to train really hard. Their training loads need to be systematically built to higher levels, to higher chronic loads. Now, in order to handle those higher level loads, you need to underpin it with some foundation. And I don't see the prehab being over here, or the medicine, sports medicine being over here, and strength and conditioning over here. We're really close together, and what we're driving towards is performance.
yeah,
Um, injury prevention is kind of like an added side effect. It's an added benefit that we get from good training. But
yeah,
when we focus on performance, then it takes all of the arguments and the headbutting out of it when we have a common goal of, okay, let's gear this program towards high performance. How are we going to train? What would our program look like if we were geared towards high performance? And your program would have local tissue loading. It would have things like your eccentric hamstring work, or your um, shoulder work for your overhead athletes, and then it would progress from that local tissue loading into general capacity and sport specific capacity loading. And that's what a good program would look like.
yeah. With the because you mentioned there sort of prehab, preparing athletes for surgery and make sure there isn't a detraining effect. Would you say that having followed making sure that you've got the high loads there, because obviously with the low loads you've mentioned there that you're not preparing them for their performance. Would you say that there shouldn't be a point that there is a detraining effect, like what you say, there should be a foundation there, or is there always going to be a time, depending on certain things, where there might be an actual detraining effect?
Well, if I understand your question, if we're looking at injury, the first thing that happens is that local tissue capacity will start to circle down the drain, and that's just due to the fact that your tissue just it needs biological healing time. We can't cheat biological healing time, and depending on what we do in rehab, sport specific capacity can follow.
Yeah,
So I think a really key thing when we have an injured athlete is we want to calm the tissue down, but as soon as possible we want to try and load within the constraints of biological healing. But we want to load early. There's some good evidence now, for muscle injuries, for example, thigh and calf strains, that if you can load pretty close to the injury, and they're saying 2 days post injury, if you can load early, it'll save you 3 weeks on the back end. So
right.
just by front ending your loading 1 week earlier, it'll save you 3 weeks in terms of return to play. But equally, there's a big gap between um, what we do in rehab in terms of decreasing pain, decreasing inhibition, improving function, and getting back to these high level performances. There's a massive gap there. So just because we've rehabbed someone really well doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready for this up here. So when we're doing that local tissue loading, I think a really important part of bridging the gap between rehab and peak performance is ensuring that we're doing some regular sport specific loading as well. So if we can't get our high speed running in because we've got a hamstring injury, then we've got to find another way to maintain sport specific capacity. Now, if we're talking about an off season, you would expect some detraining to occur over off season, and I actually, we don't want our despite the fact that there's evidence to say high loads are associated with reduced injury and better performance, and we want to try and prevent our athletes chronic loads circling down into the basement. I think it's still pretty important that our athletes get a chance to mentally refresh and get away from their sport. Just get away from it completely. Don't even think about swimming or soccer or whatever, and you can keep some load ticking over, but do it in the things that you find enjoyable. So if you're a swimmer, then maybe you go to the surf. If you normally have to run, maybe you go hiking around some nice forests or something that enables you to keep some physical load in, but also allows you to mentally recharge.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that maybe potentially is overlooked a little bit sometimes. I think if you're mentally feeling fresh when you come back, it's going to be be a lot more beneficial rather than feeling a little bit run down or anything like that. With the talking about the load and the training program and managing those factors, whether it's an off season, pre-season, or in season, what are you looking to measure or track to keep on top of to make sure that they've got enough load that they're actually it's going to improve their performance or have an effect on their performance when it comes to sort of competition?
Well, it depends a little bit on the sport, but in general, if I'm putting a program together, I need to know three things. I need to know the demands of the sport. I need to know the physical capacities that the athlete needs in order to do their job. And then the third thing I need to know is what are the factors that are limiting performance for that specific athlete. Now, and that's basically a needs analysis. So if I have someone who's aerobically really fit, but is slow, then I won't spend heap of their training time trying to put more aerobic work into them. I'll be trying to make them strong and fast. And equally, if I have someone who's drop dead fast but can't repeat it, then I've got to try and bump up his motor a little bit, keeping in mind that I don't want to make a fast player slow at the expense of just making him a little bit aerobically fitter, because then I have to explain that to the coach. When he's saying to me, "How did you make this match winner? You can't score a try now," or we've got to explain that. So, and that just feeds back. So once you've done your needs analysis and you're trying to raise capacity, then that raises capacity across the board, which then improves your athlete's ability to perform the demands of the sport. But for me, I want to look at the demands of the sport. In terms of tracking load, I look at acute and chronic load. So I want to know, well, what does my athlete need to do as a typical week? So what is the sport demand of them on game day? But equally, what does training demand of them to prepare for that for game day? And that gives you the acute load for the week. That's what you have to prepare for. And I just want to make sure that my chronic load of my athletes, or that the chronic load is high enough to make sure that they're not spiking when it comes to the weekly load. So that if the chronic load is really low and the acute load is up here, then that's going to result in a spike. So I want to make sure that the chronic load is suitably high, adequately high. And if I can't get enough chronic load, then I've just got to do my best to develop the physical qualities that are going to help them perform well in the sport and help them cope with that acute demand that comes with the sport.
Yeah. When you're talking about spikes there and acute and chronic load, what are your signs of what are you looking for when you need to change things, or how much do you speak with the athlete? Because sometimes there might be a little bit of a spike, and how the athlete is putting it across is actually they're feeling fine, but then the next week they might come in and they might be feeling really really tired. What are your signs in terms of looking to change things or alter things or improve things?
Yeah, look, I think with so much wearable technology around, it's really easy to go, oh well, we've got all these objective markers now. Well, that's we should invest in all of that. And I still remember we this is going back over 10 years now, and we used to collect so much data on for different things, different wearables, inputting different subjective monitoring as well. And I remember one of our athletes coming to me and saying, "Hey, are you looking at those numbers?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah, you look good." And he said, "Well, can you look again because I feel like crap."
Right.
And to me that was just a perfect sign that with all of these wearables, which have a place, they do have a place, but we can't forget that we're working with people. And to me, the single biggest thing that I can get from my athlete is just having a conversation with them,
Yeah.
and it tells me a lot. Now, I understand it's difficult if you've got 25 athletes to get around and see each of them, and that's where the apps in terms of monitoring well-being and general health in terms of soreness and mood and stress and energy levels comes in really handy. I think that information tells us a lot about how our athletes are coping with the load. So you might have a spike in load, and I always say, well, think twice before doing nothing.
Yeah.
Um, and and so if you spike load, then you want to know whether it's adversely affected them. If they haven't fatigued on the back of it, and they kind of shrug their shoulders and go, well, yeah, it is what it is. I realize it's a spike. I realize it was harder than what I've been prepared for. But I've got a few days to get over it. And a lot of the rugby players, that you'll know this, a lot of the rugby players, that's how they deal with things. They're tough. They're bred that way. It's a combative sport. So, but well-being is and just asking an athlete subjectively, how do you feel? That to me is probably more powerful than a lot of the objective markers that we can take.
Yeah. Do you think that's a good starting point for? Because I know, depending on the level of the coach, they might be able to get quite a lot of, apps and systems in place. Whereas at the starting point, just actually speaking to their athletes and using that as a gauge, and then as they start developing or start getting more sort of access to software, if you like, what would be a good starting point for coaches listening to progress with analyzing data, and what data should they be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started coaching and training athletes, there was no apps. There was no GPS. We didn't have heart rate monitors because we're working with some of the teams we're working with. They weren't wealthy teams. So the way that you would gauge how they're feeling is you'd just check. You'd look at their body language. You'd see the steam pouring out of their head. And they'd tell you if it was hard or not. They'd be you'd know if it was hard, and a lot
Yeah.
of the time you'd be doing it as well, so you'd know how hard it was. So yeah, I feel in some ways with that art, because we're so. I think some in some places, not all, but I think a lot of places they're so focused on the number. What's the number say? Can he train today or can't he train? When I think we've lost that human element,
Yeah.
and I look back over the early part of my career where we didn't have any of the toys, and I don't regret those days at all. And I actually think if I was to start my career now, coming in with all of the toys, I feel like I would have missed something really important.
Yeah,
And I think that those days, they allow you to when all the new toys come on the market and the new technology comes on the market, it allows you to weigh it up, and you basically say, what is the one thing I can't do without,
yeah,
or what is the least information I need to collect in order to do my job well. So when you're in that situation where you don't have a lot of resources, you don't have a lot of technology at your disposal, then you really have to fall back on, okay, what do I stand for here? What do I need in order to train these athletes and to
yeah,
to work with them well? Um, and that's when you go, well, I need to be able to eyeball these guys or girls and see how they're feeling and say, yep, yes, you're fatigued, but you've got one more rep, or you can actually push a little harder. Um, yeah,
yeah.
and the GPS unit, it won't tell you that.
Yeah, I think it is like what you said there. If you were training the athletes, and you can see that they're blowing or seeing that they're tired. It is that human element of it that you mentioned, and as well, I think if you're wanting to get the best out of your athletes and your clients, obviously getting to know them, knowing if they have, like what you said there, knowing if they have that extra rep. Because I know when clients come in for their session, the first question I'll ask them, how are you feeling? How's your day been? Whether they've had a stressful day or anything like that. And I do think sometimes, like what you said with in terms of looking at all the data, you can kind of get lost in the numbers rather than actually looking at the person in front of you. On a,
Mm.
a slightly tangent from what you were mentioning about there, do you think that's where obviously with the more toys that have come available, and obviously a lot more, you can get a lot more data. Do you think that that's where the whole thing about injury prevention has come about, compared to maybe when you first started coaching, it wasn't really a thing, you were just focusing on the performance? Because we chatted a little bit at the start about, if you focus on performance, injury prevention, you know yes, we can say we've prevented injuries because it hasn't happened. There's no numbers there. So do you think that the more data that we've now got available, injury prevention has become a thing compared to where it was before? I know that's a little bit of a tangent. It was just something I was thinking about as you were chatting.
Yeah, look, possibly. It's an interesting one. Around 2004, 2005. Um, a lot. If you read back over that time in newspaper articles, a lot of or a few teams started to use training load information and try and predict whether an injury was going to happen or not from training load information. And let's be real about it. A lot of the wearable technology companies, that was their big selling point. They would come to teams and they would say, you can use this technology to restrict the amount of high speed running your player does so he doesn't get injured.
Yeah,
Okay, so again, it's that view that was held really strongly back then, that high training loads caused injury. No one was really thinking about it the other way, that high training loads and exposing athletes to high speed running could be like a vaccine. It could protect you from injury. Um, so I think that's where it probably started. A few teams were being innovative. They were, and I think a few teams were hoodwinked as well,
right.
by some people who wanted to make a quick buck, and um, they'd roll out a neural network, or something similar, and say that we could predict injuries with 80% accuracy, or 90% accuracy. And what happens is, if your biggest player, the most important player on your team, gets injured, what would happen is some of these tech companies would contact the front office, the general manager, and say, if you had our technology, that you might still have that player. And so the front office staff who are evaluating things they don't understand, um, then contact the medical staff and say, why haven't we got this software? Such and such a team has got it, and they don't have anywhere near the injuries that we've got. So there's a lot of reasons for why, and a lot of them don't make too much sense, really, when you think about it. But they're the kind of things that have happened over the years in sport. And I'm not saying that all of these companies do that, because there's a lot of really good people working in these areas trying to make a difference and doing it in a really positive way. But there's always used car salesmen out there as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is one of those things where, especially when if it was something relatively new, you just want to use all this information and be like, yeah, this can prevent injury, this can do that, and over
Yeah,
time it gets a little, it gets refined a little bit more. It's same as coaching. There's some things that you try and just think, oh yeah, this sounds great. Oh no, actually no, that's not as good. I may as well stick with what I'm doing. But yeah, just when you were chatting there about the data side of things, and being able to speak to the athlete, it was just something that I was wondering, because sometimes, unless something is pointed out to you, you kind of don't think about it if you're just focusing on one thing. So if you've been concentrating on the performance and you've never really had any injuries, I was kind of, it's chicken or the egg kind of thing. When did that come about? One thing
you've
that I
noticed
wanted,
too that
yeah,
you notice too that injuries only matter when you start losing. So no one
yeah,
cares about injuries while you're winning. Um, and there is a school of thought too that you can almost play like a concentric or eccentric type of game. So
yeah,
if you're a soccer player or a rugby player and you're playing a concentric game, you're rolling over the top of teams. You're playing fast and through the middle, and you're bending them back. Now you don't get injured when you're winning, but when you start losing and you're getting bent back, you're playing eccentric footy, or eccentric soccer, then
yeah.
you notice you start getting injured a lot then. So that ties in with your chicken or egg. It's hard to know what comes first. Is it the fact that you start losing and then you start getting injured, or do you get injuries and then you start losing? I don't know which one, but
Definitely, it is a kind of you could go, there's quite a bit of a lot of rabbit holes you could go down there, especially on the we chatted a little bit about when you mentioned on the off season. It's quite refreshing to go off and do something else. It is a mindset thing when you're losing. It's kind of like, oh god, we'll have to try this in training, or you might force things, or do anything. So that is a different a different tangent that we can go on, but definitely something that is interesting, and I think sometimes needs to be taken into account, because one of the things that, because when things are going well, you can just keep doing what you're doing. You don't really need to go through anything with potentially a fine tooth comb. But one of my first coaches obviously said, you do learn more from a loss than you do a win. So then you need to have a look and change things, and progress. Which is interesting to think about. You
yeah, look, I
mentioned,
reckon I reckon winning hides all sins. So I agree with your coach, because you can be winning and you could have a real stench to your team. There could be a lot of really soft plays in your game, or soft efforts, but you're getting away with it because you're winning.
yeah,
But that kind of thing doesn't hold up when you come to the big games.
yeah,
So sometimes it does you a bit of a favour to lose a few games, so that you can actually kind of pull the trigger on. Okay, now you can see we need to fix these things.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is. It is, because you can, exactly like you say, just think, oh, actually, well, if things are going well, we don't need to look at anything. Um, one of the things, obviously, when we were talking about the spiking training, and an athlete came over and said, I'm feeling a little bit tired. One of the things that you talk about is obviously an athlete's floor, and obviously an athlete's ceiling. How do you look about progressing training, depending on that, because obviously is in terms of a team setting, they're going to have a program to follow, or training to follow, but within that team, obviously athletes are going to change in how much they can handle, how much they can progress. If you've got a really strong player or a really fast player, and a little bit like what we were chatting there about, thinking about getting it more right than wrong, rather than this is 100% what we're going to do. Just want to chat a little bit about the an athlete's floor and ceiling, and progressing training.
Yeah, well, look, the floor basically refers to the athlete's current capacity, what they can do now. The ceiling is what we require them to do as part of the game, and we always have a certain amount of time to get from the floor to the ceiling, and typically it's not enough. We always want more time, but the goal is that we want to progress we want to progress as quickly as we can to the ceiling, but we also need to be sensible about it. And there's two reasons why. One is we know when we rapidly change loads, there's a huge body of evidence to say that when you rapidly change loads, rapidly increase loads, it increases your risk of injury. But there's also a recent paper that's just come out looking at performance and what happens when you can either build to high chronic loads or when you rapidly change loads. When you build to high chronic loads, you get better performance. When you rapidly change loads, you get worse performance. So if you're not worried about injury at all, if you don't care about injury, then most of us, if we're working in sport or military or in the dance or the circus, we're interested in performance. We want to get to good performances. So if you're interested in that, then there's two messages. You want to build to higher chronic loads, and you want to get there as safely as you can. And then the people want they want a number. How much is safe? Well, it's going to depend on your capacity. So if you have a really low capacity, let's say you've been in bed rest for 3 years, then applying the 10% rule, for example, might be too much for that particular athlete. You might have to start really low because they've got no capacity at all. Yeah. Equally, if you've got a really high capacity and you're close to the ceiling, then adding 10% on top of that will be impossible. You're more than likely going to be putting 0.1%. So the way that I work on progressions is I look at the capacity of my athlete. I try and get an understanding of either the local tissue capacity or sport specific capacity, and the best guide of what an athlete can handle today and over the next week is what they've handled on a regular basis over a number of weeks. So and what we're talking about there is just acute and chronic loads. If they've been able to handle a moderate to high chronic load over a longer period of time, then chances are they're probably going to be able to handle that over a week as well.
Yeah. When you're talking about, because obviously you said there, you can progress it too fast, or you might, rather than the 10%, it might just be the 1%. Depending on the athlete, and you mentioned there about you might not have enough time, to get them there. Is the goal to get them to the ceiling, which is obviously their optimal, if you like, or is it a case of with limited time, get them as close to the ceiling, but not ever push them over, so they're slightly over, because depending on, obviously you want to get the best out of your athlete when it comes to game day, and it comes to the season. So when I sort of touched on getting it more right than wrong, sometimes you can err on the side of caution, or think, right, we're going to push things a little bit. What's kind of your take on that, and how do you work with your athletes? Going slightly under, hitting the ceiling, or going slightly over?
Yeah, look, this is a great question. It's a bit of a philosophical question. So let's say you're preparing for a major tournament, and you're getting players from the clubs, from the Premier League clubs, and then they're coming in to play for England for the World Cup.
Yeah.
You'll have different styles of play throughout the Premier League. And with those different styles of play, you could have a Liverpool who will have super high speed running,
Yeah.
and then there might be another team that's more of a possession based team that has lower high speed running. That is complete. They may be well off the pace of what the national coach requires. So if you don't have enough time to get them prepared from their floor, whatever it is, to get them to the ceiling, then you've got a couple of choices. One is that you just go, well, we need to get them to the ceiling, and we need to get them there as quickly as we can. And if we break a few along the way, well, that is what it is. And that's one philosophy. Another philosophy is you look at it and you go, well, we can't get them from the floor to the ceiling in the amount of time we've got. So what is the best way that we can prepare these athletes so that they're going to be best prepared for those demands of the ceiling? And you might just accept that there's going to be a gap between the floor and the ceiling, or between their chronic load and the acute load of the World Cup. And it could be that you decide, well, we're going to train, but we're going to do micro doses. So we're going to train as regularly as we can, at sub threshold doses. And even though we're going to slowly build chronic load, and chronic load may not reach the high loads that we would ideally like, what we're going to be able to do is we're going to bulletproof them in a way where we're putting a program in place to develop the physical qualities that, one, gives our players a chance to perform well. So we've got some strength and aerobic fitness and high-speed running that we're building into our players so they can perform well. But we're also developing the physical qualities that are going to help them cope with that spike in load. It doesn't guarantee that they're not going to break, but at least you're giving them a good chance of being able to tolerate that load.
Yeah. When you obviously you said there about the last little bit is, there's a chance that they might break, and especially if you're trying to if you've got a tournament coming up like that, especially for people coming from different backgrounds. Do you think that where potentially coaches go wrong is that they want a guarantee of they're not going to break, and is it a fine line between athletes where it's a little bit too much, or just getting the right balance? Because with everything, a lot of it is trial and error, and putting systems in place, and it might just not work with that athlete. Do you think that's potentially where some coaches go wrong, and is it a balance to make sure that you're not breaking athletes?
Yeah, well, look, I would actually step back and probably say that it might be maybe not the coaches that have gone wrong. Initially, it probably stems from whoever's looking at the data, and depending on how you interpret it, like I think most people interpret data with a degree of certainty and a degree of uncertainty. So it can only tell you so much, and I can tell you that I'm 100% certain when an athlete's going to break, and it's when they break. I can't tell you before. So, I think if you're involved with managing data and interpreting that data, then you need to be really careful about the message you give to a coach and how certain you are about what those numbers mean. Depending on where you read, some people would have us believe that there's a fine line between training and overtraining.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think we've got a pretty broad bandwidth to work with. You would have to do, for the most part, you would have to do something really, really crazy in your training to come up with a training load error that resulted in an injury. And typically it's a massive spike, but
Yeah.
that in isolation probably doesn't always result in injury. Definitely doesn't always result in injury. But if you've got someone in rehab and you're rushing them out, and then they break, then you probably shouldn't be too surprised by that. I think for the most part, I would err on the side of, if you work on the philosophy that you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. All right, so you're damned if you train too hard, because you might break, you
Yeah.
might, but you might not. I'm really geared towards, no, you probably won't. Um, the the flip side is you're damned if you don't. Like, if you don't train hard, that's much worse, because and the outcome of that is far worse. We used to think, by managing players away from trainings, just stopping them from training a little bit, that there was no consequence because they didn't get injured. But there's a bigger consequence. They can't perform. You send them out to on game day, and they have no control at all over the outcome. And it is a really, it's an ugly sight, because you've just got no control. Your team is a mess. All you do is walk back from the goal to restart the play the whole time. So if you push that away and you go, well, how would we train if I wasn't governed by fear of injury?
Yeah.
How would I train? And it becomes really simple. You would systematically build to higher chronic loads, um, because it develops physical qualities, and it develops a mental resilience, and that is what leads you to great performances.
Yeah.
So it becomes really simple when you just focus on performance.
Yeah, I think we've kind of come sort of full circle there, sort of, and I like the thought process of, yeah, damned if you do, damned if you don't. You can be have injury, or trying to prevent injury, hanging over your head a little bit. Whereas, exactly like what you said there, you don't know 100% when an athlete's injured until it actually happens. And exactly like you say, focus on the performance side of things. And the first question on the theme of the episode that I wanted, is it good training or prehab that's gonna stop your athletes getting injured? And a couple of topics that we've, or the conversation that we've had, yeah, you, one way or another, something is going to happen. It could be a freak thing that happened happened on the on game day, or exactly like you said, it could be something that you've just done something crazy in training, and a massive spike, and something's happened there. Yeah, quite a lot of topics covered there, and I think we've kind of come full circle. I think you finished off with a couple of words of wisdom there, but the last question that I like to ask about, all the topics that we've covered there, what would be your take home points or words of wisdom, for coaches or athletes listening to this?
Oh, look, I think there's three really key points that I like coaches to hear, I like athletes to hear, and one is train hard, and train consistently. If you build that consistency, you build to higher chronic loads, it puts you in a really good position to perform well. Prepare yourself for the most demanding passage of play. So work out what it is for your sport and get after it, attack it. If the more you do it, it's like a skill, like passing a football or throwing a javelin. The more you do it, the better you get at it, and it just becomes normal. And the third thing is we all want to get fit as quickly as possible, but we need to be sensible about it. So just try and get to those high chronic loads as quickly as you can, but as safely as you can as well.
Yeah, I think that's some 3 points there. We sort of, that was a theme throughout the chat. So I think that's some 3 points to finish on. Thanks a lot, Tim, for taking the time to chat with me. I really enjoyed that. I think there was a few tangents thrown in there, but yeah, good. I don't mind that sometimes. Yeah, when we started talking about, I quite like the idea when you said about the, concentric and eccentric in terms of winning. Yeah, we could have gone down a rabbit hole there, because I quite like
Yeah,
that the thought process of things. But yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. For everyone listening who might have any questions about what we've chatted about today, want to sort of have a look at the research and content that you've put out there, where can people find you or see the content that you put out?
Look, I think the best place is just head to our website, gabbettperformance.com. And if you type in Tim Gabbett or Gabbett Tim, you'll find me on the different social medias as well. I should say also, Stephen, that on one of our tangents, we were speaking about used car salesmen. Hopefully there's no used car salesmen that are listening into the podcast. And if I've offended you, I apologise. I could have easily said chosen another profession. So if I've offended used car salesmen, I apologise.
Yeah. There's I'm trying to think if there's anyone. No, I don't know. I don't know anyone there. It might be further afield, but I've got a second-hand car, so it's all right. It's all fine.
Oh, hang on. There's the email's pinging now from the used car salesman. Oh yeah, they're coming through nice and fast.
That's it. Downloads have dropped now. Yeah. Thanks a lot for that. For that, Tim. 100%. Everyone listening, especially I started chatting at the start about the research papers and the content that Tim's put out there. 100% have a look at that. Because it's made me understand it a little bit more, and it just makes you think about. It kind of takes that burden off your shoulder a little bit of thinking, like what we've chatted about. Injury prevention hanging over you. Exactly like Tim said, you want to focus on performance, and then things will fall into place from there. So thanks again, Tim. Thanks again to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.
Thanks, Stephen. Bye.